Right, everybody is in.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome. Hello there. Welcome, everybody. This is a my favorite day of the month where I get to show off and cavell and share the amazingly talented members of Temple Israel that we are blessed to have. And tonight we are welcoming our scholar in residence, Dr. Selin Malkoc, who is a Turkish American behavioral scientist born to secular parents in Istanbul, married to a Jewish American from the Midwest, which I'm assuming is Columbus specifically, mom to two bilingual and multicultural children, and associate professor of marketing at the Ohio State University. She does have an entire additional page of all sorts of um, things that are to her credit, which we simply don't have time for tonight, but just trust us. She's an incredible, amazing person. She is going to discuss time as a resource, decisions about allocating and consuming time. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk about some of the work that I've been doing. And, I was going to tell a bit myself and my background because that's going to become relevant as I talk about some of the ideas that I have. But that title that Vida just read is extremely long and cumbersome, but it really boils down to me wanting to understand what I call time consumption. And that's a really big umbrella of talking about what we want to do, let that be works or chore or leisure, family time, volunteering, whatever that might be, when we might want to do it and how we might want to do it. And I consider all of those decisions under the umbrella of time consumption. Now, I can tell you why I'm studying time, and I can give you 6 academic reasons as to why that's fascinating to me. But the reality is I'm studying time because research is research. And I study things that I do not understand about myself, the things that I wish I could do better, and the weird things that I notice about myself and see whether if I'm the weird anomaly or whether other people feel like me and whether I can generalize those findings and come up with ways to make things better. Now, talking about, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. I'm very used to being interrupted. You can just unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have. Okay, so one of the things that I struggle with, especially after I had kids, is what in academia we call time famine. The very basic idea that we just do not feel like we have the time to do the things that we want to be doing. I'm going to guess that at least some of the people, if not all, who are here might be feeling, a similar feeling, because 80% of the Americans do agree with this statement. It actually is not unique to being American, though it is very pronounced in this country compared to some others. Now, feeling like you don't have enough time is not a good thing. We just don't like it, but that's not all of it. If you feel this lack of time, we tend to be more stressed, more anxious, and more depressed, clinically more depressed. We might make bad decisions. We might not be delaying gratification, making poor health decisions, and even all the way to obesity, for instance. And it also leads to decreased life satisfaction, divorce, pretty much everything we do not want in our lives tend to happen if we feel like we are not having enough time. Now, looking at my life, one of the things that I was asking, and I asked for a while, is, do we really not have time? Or are we wasting time? Like, is this really me not having enough hours in the day, or am I just not using my time effectively? And when I say waste, I mean using it carelessly and maybe extravagantly, not in the optimal sense. And this matters because, by some estimates, we waste about 2 to 3 hours per day. And this could be wasting by, idleness. This could be wasting because you went to Facebook and that was just like an activity that was meant to be 2 minutes and ended up being 25 minutes. Or it could be because, you run into someone, you ended up talking, and you actually had to be, emptying the dishwasher, and now you just regret what you have done 5 minutes ago. It could be any form of waste. The question I wanted to ask was, are we more likely to wait certain time periods more than others? In other words, can I actually predict when I'm going to waste my time so that I can avoid wasting my time? So in all of my questions, as I said, it is me search. So I go back to myself and my own observations and start from there. And this was no different. The idea came about one day when I actually was going from one meeting to the other, and I observed a certain behavior. Because normally in my day, as an academic, I have a lot of reading to do. I got a lot of experiments to design, data to look at. I write a lot of papers. So I've got really things that help me advance my career, things that I actually enjoy doing and they matter to me. Right? So if I have time, especially in doing work hours, these are the tasks that I should be paying attention to, and I hope that I do. However, in this one day, I finished one meeting and I was on my way to this other meeting, and I had about an hour between the two. And instead of doing any of these tasks that I talked about, I find myself checking emails, reading some newspaper, and yes, I also went to Facebook, and I did spend that amount of time I probably should not have spent. But it wasn't that I did all of these things, because I do them sometimes, and it's relaxing and whatnot. But the question was like, why was I doing it in this hour when I don't do these things in other hours? Like, what is special about this? One thought that I had was because there was an upcoming meeting, that just made it feel like the time until that time felt very short. It just literally shrunk. And we know from like visual perception studies that if something is bold and into the future, or is sitting in front of us, the more bold it is, or the more colorful it is, the closer to us it will feel. So it was just like coming from this perceptual idea to basically say that if my time is bounded, if there's a known end to the time period that I have, I might actually feel like it's shorter and not sufficient to do meaningful things. So I'm going to go and try to test this. And, I'm going to try to show you a few of the experiments that I do for all of these things. There is many more. And as I said, feel free to ask questions if I'm not being clear enough about these. But in this first study, what we did was we asked people to, and what's on the calendar is not important at all. It's just a calendar to illustrate. We basically asked people to think about an hour of their life that was ending in a different task, a scheduled activity, and an hour in their life that they weren't. And we told them, imagine you want to read a book. How many minutes do you think you would have to read a book in this hour? Yeah. Now, when the time was what I call unbounded, meaning it was not ending in a scheduled task, people said that they have about 50 minutes in this hour that they can read the book. That's right there is interesting, right? An hour is 60 minutes, but people were cutting about 10 minutes for whatever. Like maybe they're going to go to the restroom. Maybe they're thinking that there's going to be a phone call coming in. Maybe a kid is going to come. They're basically taking this 10% as, 12% of it off and saying that I will only have 50 minutes to read. But more importantly, when we asked about this hour before an event, that shrunk down to 40 minutes. So we lost another 10 minutes by virtue of being adjacent to another task. Now, this is really interesting because it just tells us that it's not only that it perceptually shrinks, but we also feel like we will not be able to using that time in the same way. It feels like now if I have a task that's going to last 45 minutes, I'm not going to be able to do it because I feel like I got only 40 minutes, right? So it has consequences. The next thing we wanted to do was to test that idea. Can we actually look at people's behavior, actual behavior, and see differences in the way that they use it, not only whether they feel like it's a lot or not. So for this study, we have recruited people from MTurk. MTurk is an online participant platform that we use on a regular basis. And we post studies for a certain amount of money. Oftentimes studies are $5. They get paid around 50 cents to spend their 5 minutes doing studies, depending on the length. And that's how we collect a lot of our data. So in this particular study, we recruited people saying that we're understanding how people use their day. And their main task was to look at their calendars or any scheduler and tell us exactly what they had to do for the next day. Okay, so, and they entered it, if they might have a yoga class or a coffee or a meeting, whatever that might be, they told us exactly what they had to do and how long it was going to take. Then we also ask, because we don't want transition time to interfere. Like if you actually have to travel 10 minutes to the yoga class, that's not fair because that hour actually doesn't have an hour anymore. It just has 50 minutes. So we also ask them to tell us how long it would take to get to the activities or prepare for the activities, as well as moving from one activity to the other in the other end. So we have it all down. And so we can identify an hour in their day where we know is fully available to them, where they have nothing else to do or prepare, but it ends up in another task. And a separate hour for a different group of people that basically is not bounded with a different task. And so these are my schedule, my time, and I'm going to be choosing either a time that butts into a other meeting or not for every participant. And then we are going to actually offer them another study to do. We're going to say, okay, I'm going to be picking, Aaron, and I'm like, Aaron, I have a meeting. I'm going to be asking you to do a study between 11 and noon tomorrow. And you have an option. It could be a 30-minute study that is going to pay $2.50, where the hourly rate would be about $5, or a 45-minute study that's going to pay $5 and the hourly rate is higher at over $6.50. Now, this has got a few important qualities. I know that they have objectively 1 hour, right? I know that they don't have to prepare for anything else. And I know the task is going to be 45 minutes. It's also the case that the 45-minute study is objectively more lucrative and should be more attractive. But what we are predicting is that the choice behavior will be dependent on whether we ask people to make a choice for a period of time that was bounded or unbounded. And that's exactly what we find, that this was an attractive option. So this is the choice of the 45-minute study. About 85% of the people chose the longer study that pays better. But if I simply move that decision to an hour that was ending up in a different task, that went down to 75%. Okay? And remember, these are M-Turkers. They actually do spend money, their time earning money this way. So this is a really consequential decision for them, in addition to just being a quick study. So what we have learned from this, and I just showed you 2 studies, we had probably like 25 studies of different kinds that we have run for this. So if you have questions about like, what if this, what if that, please feel free to do that, because I probably have run that study and I can answer the question. What we have now learned is, okay, to the question of, are we more likely to waste certain periods of time? Well, it turns out yes. Time is wasted, more likely to be wasted right before another meeting or a scheduled event than any other period time. Now, and this happens because, as I told you, people seem to shrink the amount of time that they have. It just feels shorter when it's bounded. Now, a very obvious solution to this is to give people more time. If I feel like now I have more time, like even in the subjective feeling of more time, according to what we have found, should actually make it more likely that we are not going to waste it, because we'll feel like it's sufficient to do meaningful tasks, right? Well, let me tell you about a day of mine a few years ago that might actually argue the opposite. So I am a busy mom, 2 kids who do not like to cooperate with me in the mornings. Not that they're always going to school these days, but when they did, it's a lot of heartache and fighting and tears in some of the days. And, I'm trying to get to my meetings. My husband is trying to get to his meetings. And oftentimes we are out the door, nick of time, barely a minute to save. Now, in this one day, everything miraculously worked. Like my daughter agreed to wear the dress that I gave it to her without asking me to change it. My son actually didn't complain about his breakfast. Everything seemed to work. And Joe and the kids got out of the door, and I felt like, oh my God, like they're 10 minutes early. I feel like I've got 10 extra minutes in life. I'm going to go to the office, and before my meeting, I'm just going to like knock my emails out. This is so cool. Except that I was late for my meeting. I'm like, what happens here? Like, I felt like I had a lot of time, and now it's the opposite. I actually am running late. I'm experiencing the opposite. So this, of course, led to another research question, like what's going on here? Whether the sense of having more time, gain time, somehow is actually making me slow down and do things in a different way. Now, I talked about my morning, but we have these unexpected gains of time very frequently. Snow days have been more frequent than others this year. My kids just had 2 or 3 of those in the last 10 days. Once a year, we roll back our hours. We gain an hour. Meetings get canceled. And of course, due to coronavirus, at least early on, there was a lot of gain time where we felt like we had more time in our hands than we had initially planned for. So all of these instances could count as a gain time. And if what I'm proposing is true, anytime I feel like I gained it, I should be feeling that that time is more expensive, longer, but also as an outcome of that it's feeling longer, I might take my time and be more careless about how I spend it. Okay? So that's the whole proposition that I'm going to be trying to test here. A few hypothetical studies and then few real studies. So in this case, I'm going to test a very basic premise. We ask participants, 1/3 of them, how long does an hour feel like? And we give them a scale slider scale that they move perceptually to a point between 100 and 10. Then we said, imagine that you have the next hour free. How long does this hour feel like? And then finally, we said, imagine that the next hour, you actually plan to take your friend to the airport and he just called you and told that he doesn't need that anymore. You have an unexpected free hour. You gained an hour. How long does that feel? What I'm predicting is that because a gaining of time is literally expansion, similarly, we are going to attribute that expansion to our time as well. And the same hour will feel like it's more when it's basically gained. So the numbers themselves are not important. What matters is that when we look at baseline and free conditions, time that has always been free or just an hour, they seem to be equally long, but an hour that's gained is significantly longer. Right? People feel that a gained hour actually has more time, more minutes in it. We have done a lot of versions of the study. Generally, what people ask me, so I'm going to answer those questions, just like, what if the canceled task was different? In this case, it was riding to the airport. That might be particularly not fun. Or maybe for some people, it's a social activity and it's fun. And whether that meaning we attribute to the time is actually causing what's going on. So we have run studies where we didn't tell what was canceled. We have run studies where, a dentist appointment got canceled, which we know people don't like. There was instances where we told people that their date got canceled, in which case we know they're going to be disappointed. That seems to not matter. Whatever it is canceled, when time is canceled, anything is canceled, that time feels more expanded than any other period of time. Okay. Now, the better question is, are we doing something different with it? Again, if it's just like a perceptual effect, we really shouldn't care. But what I'm predicting is based on other work that I have done and others have done, that windfall sources, the things that comes to me unexpected, tend to be spent differently. Like if I actually got money out of a lottery versus I get my paycheck, I spend that lottery money differently than my paycheck, or a bonus is significantly differently used than a paycheck because one of them is a windfall gain and the other one isn't. Right? Based on that, we basically talked, and in organizational behavioral literature, Parkinson's law also speaks to a very similar idea. They will say that the work fills the available time that you might have, and they look at how difficult or an easy task is and try to understand its perceptions. So in this case, what we predicted was, well, if gain time feels longer, then people might just be behaving slower. They might just change their pace. Okay. So I'm going to go do a data collection that is not really coming from my normal subjects. We went to Twitter and scraped certain types of hashtags on certain days. So our target was the daylight savings day. Over 4 years. So we collected data from 2014 to 2018 in that 4-day period. And we collected that daylight savings Sunday, the Sunday before, and then the Sunday after. So I'm going to be collecting data on 3 separate Sundays. And what we are scraping is either lazy day, lazy Sunday, or busy day, busy Sunday. And it turns out there's about equal amount of these. It's not like all the hashtags were lazy and there was only a few busy days. There was actually a pretty decent distribution. What we are hoping that we are going to get is that on the daylight saving Sunday, people will be talking about being lazy more than they would have in any other Sundays before or after. Right? So when we scrape it, we ended up with about 335 tweets from that target Sunday, daylight saving Sundays, and about twice as much as that on the one before and after. Again, roughly, 300 and some in each condition. The y-axis here is going to be showing the percent of lazy tweets, right? So I basically have percent of lazy tweets and the numerator, and the sum of the others, all tweets in the denominator. I'm just basically taking a percentage count here. And what we found is that compared to the preceding Sunday, there's about a 10% increase in the use of lazy hashtag tweets on the daylight saving Sundays. And it's even stronger for the following Sunday. Is that a fluke? I don't know. Is there a separate reason why that Sunday was different? I also don't know. But what I do care is that both of those Sundays were significantly different than my target daylight saving Sundays, that people were referring to being lazy more often in these periods of time. Okay, so now we have some evidence that this gain time might actually be used differently. We wanted to have a proof of concept, if you will, and did another study, and COVID actually gave us some opportunity here. Because especially early on, if you were adhering to the lockdown quarantining criteria, we felt like we had more time than we had before. So we recruited participants online, and we asked them to think about a typical Tuesday afternoon before the shelter in place started, or we asked them to think about a typical Tuesday during or basically after the shelter in place during coronavirus quarantine time. We are going to be assuming that what's going on is before they don't have the time expansion for an afternoon because it's a regular afternoon, but during coronavirus, that afternoon might actually feel longer and more expanded. So we're going to ask how long it feels. We're going to ask whether they were rushed, whether they changed their pace. And then finally, we're going to measure whether they're adhering to the shelter in place orders as a proxy for whether their time is expended. If you're adhering by it, you should have more expended, longer perception of time. And if you're not, you shouldn't. So in this graph, the x-axis is adhering to shelter in place. If you're low, if you're in the minuses, that means you are not adhering to shelter in place, meaning your life might not have changed that much. Whereas if it's high numbers, says that your life has changed more. The DV dependent variable here is perceived time, so how long time feels. And thank God people were paying attention. What we find is that before COVID, shelter in place didn't matter, as it shouldn't matter because it wasn't a thing. So we don't see any differences. But when we look at after COVID, people who are adhering by the shelter in place feel like their time that afternoon felt longer than an afternoon that was before COVID. Yeah. Very same pattern when we are looking at whether their actions were faster or slower. When we asked them about before COVID, shelter in place, once again, of course, it didn't matter. But after COVID, the more people adhered to shelter in place, the slower they became in the way that they act in their afternoon, this said Tuesday afternoon. Okay. These are all self-reported measures, promising. It makes me happy that I can show this in different ways. But when we are doing research like this, it really matters that I can show real behavior. So in the previous scheduling kind of a situation, I gave people a real choice of a task that they would earn money. In this case, I have to do something similar. But if you have the mental exercise for a second, it's almost impossible for me to give people time, because I cannot hypothetically ask them to do it. It's very difficult to cancel an event for them on a regular basis with a random assignment. So we came up with a contrived but nonetheless working design when we are invited our participants to come to the lab. In Fisher, we have a lab where we invite participants to do studies. And half the participants, we basically told them that they were going to do a 20-minute study. And when the 20-minute study ended, we tell them the study is over. Okay. The other half of the group expected to come into the 30-minute study. But then we said, oh, the task is actually 20 minutes. You basically gain 10 minutes. You can go now. So artificially so, we gave some of the people, half of the people, about an extra 10 minutes in life. Okay. Now, I also need a measure. What am I going to measure to look at their pace? Well, we came up with the idea of putting a bunch of tchotchkes, if you will, into a box, multiple boxes actually in this case. And we told the participants, this is the last study of the semester. We have got a lot of leftover stimuli from previous years. It's just like all sorts of little odds and ends. Feel free to stop by, look at them, and take as many as you like. We are doing this as a way to give something in the middle so they can slow down or, speed up as they see fit. And we are going to measure how long it takes them to leave their desk and go all the way to the elevator passing these boxes. To be able to do that, a poor research assistant sat on the floor and actually had a clock in his hand, although she was acting like she was on her laptop, and literally timed every single person as they're leaving and then stopped it when they get to the elevator. Right? So that's the way that we are trying to capture this. What we find, oops, I don't know what happened there, is that it should say seconds. I don't know why they are not there, but the people who actually gained time was about 4 seconds slower than those who actually didn't. And if 4 seconds seems like a very short time, it is. I'm not going to argue that we got a huge effect, but we are also only measuring something that would normally take 5 seconds. Right, like leaving from the lab, going to the elevator is like a 5-6 second activity. So we gave something in the middle, and we were able to move them by about, in this case, more than 10%, about 18% slower, if you will. When we looked at taking an item, that was also the same. So this is a proxy for whether they stopped to do this, not necessary activity, extravagant activity, if you will. It's not necessary that they should do it, but they can stop and get something that they might never use in their life, You get those little putties and they are fun, but most people don't use it. They put it somewhere in their dorm and they never see it again. So there's a lot of frivolous items here as well. And we saw a similar pattern that if people felt like they gained time, if you gave them 10 more minutes in their day, they were more likely to stop and look at this, which probably explains why they were also slower in getting to the elevator. Okay. Now we have a second factor. Gain time seems like it's going to be feeling longer, and so it's going to be feeling more wasted. Now, I've got whole sets of other things to talk about, but I want to stop here and see if anybody has any questions about lacking time versus wasting time, what conditions, time might be wasted and so forth. If there is any, feel free to interrupt me and ask.
How does this data break out when you look at age cohort, educational background, and socioeconomic professional background?
I do not have specific as to each category. What I can tell you that in every study, we collect that information and we look if it matters, and we find that it doesn't. So in the last study that I reported, in expansion of time, that was only students, so there was nothing really to look at there. When we look at MTurk, we tend to get a bigger age range, but we also don't get the higher socioeconomic ground. So there's just like, that's the kind of caveat in what we have there. In the daylight savings data, for instance, that was like collected from everywhere in that study. I didn't have a chance to see individual demographic differences, if you will. But my guess is that because this is a perceptual effect, I wouldn't expect it to matter per any of the ideas that you talked about. But let me put a caveat in there. We do know that time actually feels like it goes faster as you age. So people's internal clocks change. So there is a main effect of age. Kids can stare at the same thing over and over again and not get bored, whereas like our brains work different. There's neurological research that shows that. So there's a main effect of age. But what we seem to be finding in all the time perception studies that I do is that being a constant, these effects actually make a change for everyone to some extent.
Thank you.
That answer your question.
Dr. Malkoc,
Yes, Michael.
is there any data for similar studies that were done pre-2007, which is when the first iPhone was released?
No. This is all post my second child. So post 2016. I started asking these questions after my second child because my life became particularly hectic. Who is that watching there and smiling as I said that?
Yeah, I mean, you've been on mute, so you haven't heard the craziness going on in the background here. But have any of your colleagues that are older have anything to see what the increase, if you want to call it, in waste of time since then?
My gut feeling is that the ease in which we can do frivolous activities expanded so much with the mobile technology that has to be a factor. But we know that clearly, like stuff like Facebook and social media are used more now than before, but they also weren't present before. So it's not only the mobile technology, but a lot of other tasks and activities and things that we can do in life after the mobile technology was possible is actually, I think, causing the time. Pre-2006, pre-Facebook, I wasted time by reading a newspaper, which was not really wasting that much of a time. These days, we have got much more interesting ways of actually doing less meaningful things. But I don't know if it would be mobile technology or actually all the other platforms that is available. That would be hard to separate out.
Selin, I'll just chime in here real quick. Another example would be my mother, who I think I saw peeking in on this call, was famous for reading books at red lights. So she would carry around a book in any spare moment she had. So, maybe we found other ways to do it when we didn't have it.
I was wondering if I'm one of those people that tends to arrive early to things, but on the opposite end of that, I also have some friends and relatives that are always, always, always late to stuff. So I guess my question would be, like when you were talking about, people giving themselves kind of that 10-minute window for a 50-minute task, have they done studies on people who are always late, finding that their perception, like you were talking about perception of time changing when you're older? I didn't know if there were any studies or anything, just how people that have a tendency to be late are not perceiving time the same. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. No, as you ask the question, I'm wondering why I never done that research. In my household, we have one of you. My husband likes to be early to everywhere, and the Turkish in me is late to everything.
Right.
But I do not know that we have differences in time perception, and I think that's a valid question. And I think my intuition is that you're right. I think I look at the time, and time feels like we have got enough time to do whatever is next. And Joe tends to look at what needs to be done before we get there. So he seems the time as shorter because it's occupied by things that needs to be done. One would need to separate whether if it's about paying attention to time or what needs to be done. But I would be surprised if time perception didn't play into that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, I think like my problem is that things always take longer than I expect them to. And so that may be the difference between you and your husband, because that happens to me all the time. I expect a task to take 20 minutes and it ends up taking 35 minutes.
Yeah, and that's entirely different phenomena, and you're not alone. Let me just start with that. There is a whole literature trying to look at why things take longer than what we should and why we never learn that it will, right? We repeat things in life. I know that cooking that dinner is not going to take 20 minutes as I planned. Things going to get interrupted. It's going to be 20 minutes. It's going to be 25 minutes. But we rarely learn that things are going to change because we One of the biggest reasons is like whenever something takes longer than it should, it turns out we attribute to the idiosyncratic factors in that particular instance, because every time it's something slightly different. One time it can be a phone call. And then we tell ourselves, well, this time my phone is not going to ring, so it should take 25 minutes. But next time it's the child walking from the other room, right? And we tell ourselves, well, this time it took longer because of my child. But the third time it ends up being because something in the news grabs your attention. So every time there's a slightly different reason why things take longer than it should. So we fail to learn because we never generalize and basically tell ourselves that it's going to be something. So my advice to you is not to try and be upset about things being long, but just planning for longer periods of time in the first place, if that is at all possible or makes sense.
Is there any difference based on gender?
The quick answer is no. Oftentimes, these effects hold for men and women. I paused for a second because once in a while, we'll get really wonky gender effects. And gender effects actually do happen because unlike me and Joe, generally women tend to be much more studious and they tend to be much more responsible, especially in the younger populations that we look at. And we find that interacting once in a while, but overall, everything that I talked about, if I divide it by gender, the effect holds. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller, but the basic pattern holds. I know Andrew's thinking about a particular example there, but. Okay, so I'm gonna move on and, I'll most likely not go through everything, which is fine. I really much rather have a conversation here. But I wanna switch gears from like wasting time and, not having time to assuming I have time, what do I do with it, right? And as Bita was introducing me, I am from Turkey, but I live in the US. I've been here for 20 years. At any point in time, I actually have at least one Turkish au pair living in my house. So I've got a lot of connection back to my culture. We go back every year, at least once, oftentimes staying a month at a time. And over the years, I came to realize that there is a very distinct difference in how we understand time. In US, time is simply a resource to be maximized. We think about it, we compare it to money, right? And we try to get the most out of that time in every way possible. It's literally an optimization task. And it's true because time is a resource. Time is allowing us to make money. Time is allowing us to get to our goals. So it's clearly a resource from that perspective. In Turkey, however, and I'm going to call that we as well because I'm a we in both of them, the time is the medium through which we live. Right? And what do I mean by that is literally the things that I do with my hours add up to my days, to my weeks. And in your lifetime, when you look back, we are what we did with our time. Nothing more, nothing less. So time is literally how we live. And Turks tend to take that perspective and treat time not to be something maximized, but something to be enjoyed. And sometimes to a fault, let's be honest. Those who have been in Turkey will know that. So what I want to talk about now is a few ways in which, by trying to maximize time, ways in which we try to maximize time and some outcomes that might come from it that we did not anticipate. One of the ways we maximize time, I find, is by putting off leisure. We are so focused on wanting to finish our chores and responsibilities and work. At least a group of people, this is not everyone, you'll see it's an individual difference measure, that some group of people want to say, you know what, let me finish work. I don't want it to hang over my head. There will be time for leisure later. So the question is, does that really happen? And if it happens, what are the consequences? The basic consequence then becomes, if I have time, I choose work over leisure. Right? That's the very simple consequence. We have looked for data, and what we have found is that when we ask people if they want more time in life, I'm going to go back to gaining time here for a second. Everyone says they want more time. No surprises there. Probably not also surprising, more people says that they want that time to be able to do leisurely activities. not more work-like activities, right? But if I actually ask them, hey, you have a few extra hours in your life, what do you want to do? They do not tell me that they want to do leisurely fun stuff. They actually tell me that they want to do their chores. Okay, and this is a very robust effect. And oh, that is wrong. It's 76% says work. I'm so sorry. It just needs to be the other way around. We consistently find that people say that if they're gaining time, they actually want to do things that are responsibilities, chores, and work, and not leisurely things. Now, what is the discrepancy here? The biggest discrepancy is when I ask people, what do you wish for life? They're taking this big picture perspective of what I would wish in my life would be, but they're not thinking about the specifics of the day, because the day is filled with all sorts of things that needs to be done. And if I give you time, you're not thinking about the big picture, you're actually thinking about those itty-bitty details. And the big goal of being happy in life is not salient. What is salient is getting all those little things off your to-do list. Right? So that's the kind of idea that we're going to be doing. And we are going to be utilizing a very similar paradigm to that I talked about with the gain time project before. I'm going to ask people to think about gaining time, or I'm going to try to find times that they gain time and look at whether they chose to do work or leisure. Now, we were lucky enough to have a faculty in my department cancel a class. I'm like, okay, canceled class is a perfect gain time. I can actually go see what people did with their time. So the class was supposed to be Thursday. There was 3 sections, they get canceled. And then next Tuesday, when students go back to class, the faculty member was kind enough to give a little survey to the students asking what they have done with this hour and a half that was canceled. Okay, so this is a very rough cut of like us seeing what happened. So here, we are not looking at a dichotomous choice of work or leisure. We can actually see how much of the time was spent on one versus the other. And what we find is that overall, most people divided up their time, though there was many instances of just like only doing one thing or the other. When we aggregated though, we found that about 60% of that time was gone on more work-like tasks. And when we say work, it's not for students only classwork. Washing the dishes would be it, going to the laundry would be it. So anything that feels like a responsibility is classified under work in this scenario. We also asked if this was a productive hour or a not productive hour. And that gained hour felt productive. And the day also overall felt more productive than any other day. So it seems like this gain time actually didn't make them more enjoy. And we also asked enjoyment questions. They were not different. It's not like they enjoyed this day more, but instead they felt more productive. Another interesting fact is, if you might remember, actually I can just go back, there was 3 sections. This gives us a very interesting contrast, because one can say at noon or 3, those are regular university hours. That's when you're expected to do work and study. But evening is different. In evenings, people tend to relax. So it could be that maybe there are differences across these 3 sections based on that. And we find that it doesn't matter whether the cancels class was at noon, afternoon, or at 5:30, the same pattern hold. People were more likely to spend that time on work-like activities. A very rough cut at things. It's clearly not the perfect way of studying it, because the behavior is only self-reported and probably is prone to some errors. I'm still trying to find the real behavior to do it for this study. I'm yet to find it. But I have done some other studies to understand this like work first idea, putting off leisure, and whether that's really responsible for everything. So in a different study, we asked people to imagine they're either having 3 hours of free time, or that something got canceled unexpectedly this evening and they got 3 hours. And we are intentionally making the time an evening time, just so that we are not cueing them to do work like this. We are cueing them in like what would be normally a leisurely time. Then we ask them, how would they want to spend the time? So they tell us what that task is, what they're going to do. And then they self-rated on a scale where 1 is work-related or work-like, and 9 is enjoyable leisurely task. So they themselves classified that activity they identified. Then we also measured what they call their lay belief, whether they have a tendency to believe that work tasks need to get out of the way before leisure can start, or whether doing a work task is better, and then there's always leisure time into the future. Now, as you will see, there is a continuum here. Some people really believe in this and other people don't. And of course, there's always people in between that fall somewhere in there. So what I'm going to try to show you here is in that horizontal axis, it's this belief, work first, fun later. For negative numbers, smaller numbers, these are the people who does not believe in this. So they are not putting work first or leisure later. And then as the numbers get more positive, these are the people that tend to really believe in this, like finishing off work before you can get to leisure. What we find is that that is directly related to whether people choose to do work, which is not that surprising. But what we really care about is that that interacts with what is gain time. So while this is the case for everyone, if you feel like you should put off leisure, you're more likely to do work. It is really the case when the time is gained. It's the case when should I be doing my time right? This is also a drop effect. A second way of looking at this, and this was like really important to me because I want to fix this. Like I look at my Turkish friends who enjoy life more because they actually take that moment to smell the roses and actually do the leisurely things when they have the time. They do not constantly put it off. So I'm trying to figure out like what does it, under what circumstances it gets worse or better. So for this study, we started very similarly, the same two conditions. Half of the people imagined free time, half of the people imagined having a gain time. But then we had a second factor. For half the people, I gave them a made up to-do list. Okay, I said, imagine this is your to-do list. And what I'm going to try to see is that if making the to-do list salient actually has an effect, and whether that, importantly, whether that effect is working together with these beliefs. So there's going to be lots going on in this graph, so I'm going to go one by one. And the y-axis, the horizontal axis, once again, we have the same belief. If the numbers are higher, people will be believing that work should come first and leisure should come later. If the numbers are smaller, that's not going to be the case. I'm going to divide everyone, although this is a continuum to represent them easily, as to people who don't believe this as much and as to people who believe this a lot. I'm going to show results separately for those people. And then I've got the baseline, those people who did not see a to-do list versus those who saw a to-do list. Okay, are you with me so far? Looking around, looks like it. Okay, so what we find is that if people do not believe in this, and in this instance, they seem to think that leisure can come anytime because that's the opposite of the belief, they tend to always choose leisurely tasks. Okay, so they always fall below that leisure work line. Whether they had the time was free or gained has a small effect, but not that big. Whether there was a to-do list or not doesn't have a big list because they actually think that whatever is on their to-do list, it's fine to put it aside and engage in like leisurely tasks if I actually have the time. Okay. But for the people who endorse this work first, fun later lay belief, we see a very different pattern. First of all, when we look at the baseline, this is not to-do list. I just told you, you gain time or you have time. We find that people, when they find this extra time, they're far more likely to engage in work-like tasks, far, far more likely. Okay, they take this opportunity of extra time and they want to put it to good use and be productive. What's interesting is that these people, if I remind them their to-do list, all that does is that now, even when they have free time, they want to do work. Right? They basically remember that they have work to do, which should come first. And they, even under the discretionary free time that they felt like they have, they switch their behavior and prefer to do work first. This is pretty profound because we all have our to-do lists and it's very rarely not very salient. And this simply tells us that if anyone else have a tendency to put off leisure, just basically get out of that mindset to some extent, because the reality is that to-do list never, ever ends. There's always things getting added to that running list that we have to do. So if this is the mentality, we keep on pushing off leisure and it just never comes. And, in my case, the leisure becomes, having a show in the background while I'm still doing work. So my leisure becomes a multitasking attribute, not something that I dedicate myself to. The other example that I want to talk about, and when I tell the story, there's going to be people in this audience that actually know the person I'm talking about. Now, my husband, Joe, when I first took him to Turkey, this was a profound moment for me. I took him to the beach. And my idea of a beach looks like this. It's a bunch of sunbeds, nothing to do, lay down, enjoy yourself, don't do much else. Right? Read a book if you must, but that's all. Now, when we first walked into this particular beach with Joe, this was his first time in Turkey, he wanted to find things like these. He's like, where are the activities? We want to be productive. There is the beach volley, there is the water sports. Like, when are we going to be doing these things? And I'm like, I don't understand the question. Why do you need them? We're on a vacation, we're going to relax. And he's like, no, but this is not a productive use of my time. I actually want to be productive and be, using it for good use. And I'm like, no, just resting and lying there is good use. Let's do that. So over the years, I went his way and he came my way, and we are just like somewhere in the middle. But this was like a moment of me seeing, is he taking this productivity far? The point of thinking like pure leisure that is not very active is actually wasteful. Can he not even relax under those circumstances? And this is important because there's a lot of work that shows that we are more and more into productivity these days. There's a lot of articles that talks about how we should be making our leisure time more productive, how we can go to vacations and be more productive. So this is just like a phenomenon that is really taking effect, and it's around us on a regular basis. So we asked, do people believe that leisure is wasteful? Not that it is not productive, but it's straight out wasteful. Again, I'm going to show you the questions we asked. It turns out in all of our studies, about 30% of the people agree with this. That is a lot of people. And as you're going to see, this is going to be all around the world as well. This is not only an American value. Then we wondered, what are the consequences? Choices will likely be different. Enjoyment, what about happiness in life? Is this belief actually making people more or less happy? So what we have done is we collected data from 3 countries. Americans, Indians, and French. And these were intentional choices because, productivity focus is a very American idea. In cultural studies, Indians are on one end of industriousness, even more so than Americans. And French, as we all know, like their leisure time a lot. So we wanted to pick very different audiences to look at. And we asked them these questions. These are the leisure is wasteful questions. Time spent on leisure activities is often wasted. People should strive to make spend more leisure time more productive. Most leisure activities are a way to burn time. So these are pretty extremely worded items. We are not saying that you should be productive. We are straight out saying that leisure might be bad. Okay. Then we measured clinical anxiety, clinical depression, and stress of all kinds. Now, here is the international data. As you can see, in France, less people believe that leisure is wasteful. Right, so the left side of that graph is lower numbers. There's very few people that actually fully says that leisure is wasteful. And there's so much more of that in the US and even more so of that in India. So we clearly have cultural differences in people believing leisure is wasteful. The question is, if they believe it, even in France, will they have the same outcomes? And the answer is yes. In all 3 subsamples, individually or together, people who think leisure is wasteful are more likely to be stressed in any shape or form. They are more anxious and they're clinically more depressed. Okay, so this is a pretty robust effect, and I find it very striking because we can even find this pattern in a culture like France, where we know that the distribution is different, but nonetheless, to the extent that some people believe it, the effect seems to be happening. The one thing we wanted to do is like, okay, this is good, but is it the case that there is a belief and we cannot play with it? Or can I actually make people believe leisure is wasteful? And by the same token, can I actually make people believe leisure is productive? Can I move them to the other direction? So We did what is known as a priming task in psychology. Well, 1/3 of the people read an article about breakfast. This is our control condition. We don't care much about that. The other third read an article about, is leisure wasteful? The answer is yes. And this was meant to look like a New York Times article. And it talked about like a survey showing that it is the case and backing it up with some scientific knowledge that the answer might be yes. And the third version where we ask, is leisure productive? And this was affirming the other side of the belief that it's actually a good thing. Okay. Now, this is in our lab. Participants come, and normally, just to give you a perspective, these students do mind-numbingly boring surveys after surveys for 30 minutes, right? So they are not in a place where they're enjoying themselves. What we have done is, after they read these articles, we gave them a Tetris game. We said, this is an enjoyable task. This is still within the bounds of a study. Just we want you to take a mental break and play a game. And all we are going to measure is if they actually enjoyed playing Tetris. What we find is that the people who believe leisure is wasteful enjoyed it significantly less than those who thought it was productive, or those who were in the baseline condition. So regardless of what their original beliefs were, regardless of what they normally believe in, I could actually move them, and even making them read an article about leisure is wasteful is making them enjoy this task that they actually must do. It's not even a choice, less enjoyable. Right? It's not surprising that these people might go and choose productive activities over leisure. But even if they found themselves in a situation they should enjoy, they cannot enjoy it as much. Right? A corollary to that, a question is like, is it unique? Is it every task? Can we actually identify some leisure tasks to be a little bit different? And my co-author, an old doctoral student, had a really cool idea of looking at activities during a leisurely time, Halloween, and classifying them as what we would call terminal or instrumental. Terminal tasks are, let's start with instrumental. Instrumental tasks are the things that we do because they serve a secondary bigger goal. So if you're taking kids trick-or-treating, it's not only the activity that you get utility from, but it actually serves to connect you better with your family, and you feel like you contributed to wellness of your family. Right? If you're handing out candy or trick-or-treaters, you feel like you are a part of your community above and beyond doing the task. If something is terminal, it's just done for a fun period. Right? Going to a party, going to a bar and club, and we ask people to rate these activities. We know which activities these people think that is terminal versus instrumental. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to measure their enjoyment of what they have done during the Halloween, and we are going to measure their belief. We are going back to measurement because I cannot manipulate it here. So the x-axis here again is leisure beliefs. The higher the number, the more people think that leisure is wasteful. The lower the number, the more they don't think it's wasteful. We see a very interesting pattern. For terminal activities, activities that are done for enjoyment, presumably the definition of leisure, believing in this idea that leisure is wasteful actually decreased enjoyment. Those people enjoyed their leisurely activities less. But for the activities that they viewed instrumental, we actually have the opposite pattern. Because they think leisure is wasteful, when they find a leisure task that happens to be not terminal, they actually strive in it and they find utility in the fact that this was serving a bigger goal. Right? And this is important because given that at least 30% of the population believes in that, it gives us a pretty good prescription as to how we can fix it. By giving some more meaning to a leisure activity other than pure enjoyment, we can hopefully increase the utility of those activities and also avoid some of the worst outcomes that I talked about. Okay. Last quick thing I want to show before I go is maximizing utility by scheduling. And I talked about this a lot. This has been written in press a lot too, but also came from observations from cultures where, my kids' life, even their play dates are scheduled so to the minute. And that is still not the case in Turkey. People still come unannounced to your door just because, and everything is spontaneous. So there was this question of like, is scheduling a good thing or a bad thing? And I had the intuition that it might not be so good, that when I schedule things, I feel like I have to do them. It just gives me a sense of obligation and it makes it feel like it's work and I dread it. So here we again see if that's the case. We have asked people to imagine a time where they're either like seeing a friend early on and scheduling a coffee date later in the day, or they just run into a friend and they just go to coffee together, right? So if it was scheduled earlier or not. And what we find is that if the task is scheduled, people think it's more work-like. And this is bad. But we found after a lot of studies, a solution to it, or what we called a roughly scheduling. And this really is a wonderful thing because in a lot of studies we found it takes all the negatives of scheduling and it gives all the positives of scheduling. So the roughly scheduling is the idea that you make a plan, but you do not set boundary conditions to it. You say, let's meet on Thursday afterwards, and we'll touch base. You put it there, you make the plan, and then you actually don't put boundaries around it. And when that happens, actually feeling like it's work diminishes significantly. More importantly, though, the work control matters, but enjoyment really comes up with it as well. And when you roughly schedule things, even enjoyment increases. So this is a study where we set up a coffee shop where in the previous university that I was working on. This is during finals. And research assistants went around giving tickets, actual tickets to people on the campus. Hey, take a break, come to Bar Hall, we'll give you free coffee and snacks. We had coffees around. And we had a rough time period, 6 to 8, written into the ticket. Okay. The other half of the people randomly got a different ticket. All was the same, except we told them, hey, we need to make sure that we have enough cookies in the time frame. Can you tell us when you plan to come? And they wrote the time there, we give them the ticket. So when they come back, we are looking at whether they did come back, and if they did come back, are they enjoying it? What we see is that if they scheduled it, they are more likely to come. So there is the intuition of scheduling makes sense because they kind of made a commitment by writing that number down, so they're more likely to show up. But when they show up, they do not enjoy it as much. They actually report decrease in enjoyment. And this is another effect that we replicated quite a few times. The good news is, I have impromptu there, that's not quite the right title. The thing to pay attention is like the 6 to 8 window wasn't an unplanned activity. It was just a roughly planned activity. And we find that over and over again that roughly planning is equal to impromptu. So we can really ease a lot of the negatives that come with scheduling leisurely activities by just not putting time frames around it, especially the beginning time, it turns out. So to wrap up, I think one of the things that I try to convince people is that this time as a maximizable resource is a uniquely American mindset that other cultures don't always share it, and it can come with certain consequences that are unintended. If they're intended, that doesn't matter, but the unintended ones are the bad. We might lack time, but we also waste it. Ironically, scarcity and abundance both can lead to wastefulness. When I feel like I don't have enough time, or when I feel like I've got too much time, I might end up doing non-optimal tasks. So here, something that I try to do and not always succeed is the notion of like, don't trust your gut feeling of how much time you have. Actually trust the clock, that if it tells you if it's 60 minutes, it's actually 60 minutes. It's not your internal perception of how long that time is gonna be. We tend to desire leisure, but engage in work, especially if we focus on completing work tasks. So here, I think important lesson is to remember that to-do list will really never end. And we have to remind ourselves that is just like an effort that is not going to be successful. So we might as well take a break. Our focus on productivity can be taken too far. But here, thinking that an activity achieves a higher goal actually helps and increases enjoyment and presumably mitigates a lot of the downsides. And finally, scheduling leisure can decrease enjoyment because it feels like an obligation, but roughly scheduling leisure actually gives us best of both worlds. We get to commit to it and do it, are more likely to do it, and also enjoy it more if we find ourselves doing it. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'll also put my email there. If you have any questions, anybody wants to reach out, feel free to send me an email. I'd love to talk. And I have time to answer questions if anybody wants to stick around, but I know I'm 5 minutes past my time too. Any questions, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Selin. One question about the last studies. It showed that you use, I think it was all undergraduate students for the drop-in and the other things.
In those two studies, yes.
Do you think that it would have been markedly different if you had used graduate students or non-students at all? Like professionals that may have a little bit more leeway in their schedule or not?
You wouldn't know how many times I had to answer that question. And at some point I stopped speculating and I ran the studies. The answer is no.
Really?
This affects, now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't say that everyone who schedules their leisure activity does not enjoy it as much. This is a extent,
Yeah.
right? This doesn't mean that every time X happens, Y is going to follow, or Y happens, X is going to follow. But when we run the studies with MTurkers that are like more of an average age of 36, we get the same effect. We have run studies going to the park, like in St. Louis when we were there, there was a Shakespeare in the Park where people would go, and we asked them, like, did you schedule or did you decide at last minute, and how much are you enjoying it? We find the same correlation with those people. We asked random strangers on the malls about the last movie they have seen and whether they scheduled it. So this is a pretty robust effect, and it has been extremely difficult to publish because for a lot of people, it's just something they didn't want to believe. The reviewers just did not want to believe it. And academics also happen to be people, they think their work is actually leisurely and enjoyable. So they especially resisted the idea that we were saying that maybe scheduling their leisure, which is their work, is a bad idea. So it was very tough. I reported 16 studies in the paper, and we have probably run close to 100.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I had somebody ask if you could put the list up again, your final thoughts, if you wouldn't mind, your last, yes, that. Thank you so much.
I just wonder, have you ever done any time studies on meetings? I mean, wasted time or time that people resent being in meetings, or time, you're laughing at me.
I haven't, but I talked about it a lot. You know, my husband recently became the department chair, and he basically sends an email saying that this could have been a meeting, but I'm just going to send an email because, you know, we get into these meetings that doesn't really need to happen. And a lot of us feel like it actually feels wasteful. I think there's a lot of it. I am not an organizational behavior researcher, so that's why I refrain from meetings in the work setting a little bit more, because my university prefers that I study more consumption-related topics. But there are people who are studying meetings in some extent, trying to find very similar patterns.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It does seem like from your research that it makes more sense to schedule like back to back rather than giving yourself a break in between, and that you'll be so much more efficient, since clearly that time that you've given yourself in between often is wasted.
Yep.
So you agree with that statement?
I do. I mean, I think I don't like making blanket statements because there's a lot of individual differences and, you know, burnout and preferences in there that might stand in the way of that being successful. But all else constant, I think back-to-back scheduling with maybe little breaks in between is better than trying to have like them separated out. At some point, we have asked people, both students, especially students, whether they thought block scheduling their classes is better than spreading them around. It turns out the intuition isn't there. So it was a 50-50 split. Half the people thought that stacking it is going to make them more productive and better students, and the other half thought that spreading it around on different days and different times was going to matter. So I don't think people have a clear intuition, but if the goal is productivity, yeah, I would endorse your conclusion there. Anything else?
Thank you.
So much.
Welcome.
Did I cut somebody off? Did somebody have one more question?
I don't
Thank you
think,
so much, Dr. Malkoc. We are so grateful that you shared your wisdom and time with us this evening. I think you did put your contact info, so if anybody was interested in contacting Selin, you can certainly
if you
do so.
Google the name, the first thing that comes up is the university website, so it shouldn't be that hard to find. And, you know, we academics love to talk about our research ad nauseum. So honestly, if there's any questions or thought, we'd love to talk and answer questions. It wouldn't be an imposition at all.